Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane. I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts. And I had to say Massachusetts because, of course, Paige is a world figure, and we probably have people from all over the place. And as you can tell from the chat, that is absolutely true. We're going to start our conversation in just a minute. I just want to say a couple of things. One is I'd like to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programs. And I would like to thank Paige for letting us share this program with other libraries, because when libraries get together, we just make magic. And I think that is true for everywhere in the world. So go to your local library. Um,
Amen.
yes, thank you very much, Paige. You can buy signed books from Paige from Aesop's Fable, our local bookstore. When you buy it, you get a signed book plate from Paige, or you can find Paige's book at your local library, of course. And we're going to have a presentation. As you can tell, Paige is going to talk for about 35-40 minutes, and then we're going to go to Q&A. If you have questions for Paige, please put them in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen. I will be turning the chat off during her presentation, and I'll turn it back on when she's finished so that you can all chatter with each other, but are not distracted during. So I'm so excited to have Paige here because I love to travel, but I also love this book because it really talks about what does it mean to be a tourist? What does it mean to be a person who lives in a place that is highly touristy? So like in the US and in Massachusetts, we talk about Salem, Massachusetts a lot because a couple years ago, I don't know what happened, but they had like 300,000 people visit them in the month of October. So we know that everybody there was just like, what? We did not sign on for this. But that's like the more and more people are traveling. This is such an incredible book. And I just appreciate you being here, Paige, with us. So welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mina. Thank you so much for having me. And I appreciate the anecdote about Salem, Massachusetts, because I mean, tourism is such an immense phenomenon. I mean, it has touched like every corner of the planet, basically, cities, rural areas, wild landscapes. Tourism happens just about everywhere these days. And actually, this year in 2024, we're going to see 1.5 billion international tourist arrivals, which is a record-breaking figure, breaking the record from before the pandemic. And so I think, it's at this moment where more and more of us are traveling and more of us are kind of being a little bit more reflective about our travels. So I really hope that this book is coming at a moment where it will find an audience that's really, ready to engage in these kinds of topics in a way that I hope is really engaging and fun as well.
I just saw your slides and I'm totally enamored with this whole talk.
There's a very brief little sort of flick through there that you got me. You'll get more. You'll get more now.
Okay, well, definitely let us know a little bit more about yourself as you go into this talk, and I will be back when you're done, and we will have that Q&A time with our attendees.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Mina. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining me today. I'm so excited to share this book with you. It publishes today. So today is the book's birthday. It's been gestating. It's been a long gestation, almost 3 years now. And in a lot of ways, the story of this book is the story of my life over the last few years, or even longer, because as Mina mentioned, I'm an American by birth, but I've lived outside the United States for a long time. I actually left the US in 2008, and I've moved around a lot and have done a ton of traveling in that time and a ton of writing in that time. But just to kind of get going here, it was really in 2018 that the germs, like the seed of this book started to germinate. And it was in 2018 that I moved with my family to a little village in the French Alps, this beautiful little village here that you see in the photo. Lovely river running down the middle of it, beautiful mountains in the background. And this village in the French Alps really relies, the cornerstone of the local economy is tourism, right? And so before I moved to this village, I'd been a journalist for a long time, reporting on economic and political issues. And I had done some travel writing on the side, writing features, for the Washington Post and for the BBC and this kind of thing. But I kind of saw that as sort of a side project, whereas my real kind of serious work was the more economic and political journalism. But it was really moving to this village and seeing, and experiencing in a very personal way how tourism gave life to this community, economic life, but also social life and cultural life. I mean, tourism is essentially the reason why this village didn't become a ghost town, in the decades following World War II. And so living in this place, I really started to appreciate kind of for the first time in my life, the real power and significance of this phenomenon of tourism, which I like to think of as an industry, yes, but also much more than just an industry, right? It's really sort of this a very multifaceted phenomenon. So I moved to this little village. This is 2018. I'm starting to think about this. Here's another photo. I took this photo at the back of a beautiful nature reserve that's just at the end of where the road dead ends that leads out of the village. And this nature reserve is a major draw for tourists in this part of the French Alps. It gets a few 100,000 visitors every year. So when you think of a few 100,000 people and it's such a rural, remote area, that's going to come with some challenges. So at the same time that I really was seeing how tourism was giving life to this place, I also, like, as anybody who lives in a tourist area can probably sympathize with, I experienced some of the more challenging aspects of tourism. And I want to emphasize that in this little village, the positives, I think, in so many ways outweigh the negatives. But of course, there were challenges like, sometimes I sat in bumper to bumper traffic on my way home from the grocery store, just trying to get home because of the weight of tourists in sort of August or February. There were moments where, the parking lot in our local village was overflowing at 8 o'clock in the morning when I'm trying to get there to drop my kids off at school. There are challenges that I learned to navigate. And at the same time, this is sort of 2018, 2019, we're seeing stories like this. We're seeing, this is obviously from Barcelona. This is a Guardian story from June 2018, where we're starting to see, more pushback in some places. And this is really, the story of the few years leading up to the pandemic. Tourist numbers globally were growing really quickly. And this is happening for all sorts of reasons that I get into in the book. But suffice it to say for now, that the pressures of tourism, as I was kind of living in this place and thinking about these issues in a really sort of in-depth way for the first time, really thinking about tourism that way, I'm also seeing news like this. And all of this stuff is kind of really prompting me to start thinking about tourism in a different way. And then, of course, what happened? We had the pandemic. All of us stopped traveling. We're all stuck at home. And this is when really the idea, like the idea for this book started to really kind of take shape and take hold, because I was thinking, okay, hopefully, right, at that point, I didn't know for sure, the pandemic isn't going to last forever. We're going to come out of this. And I just kind of knew in my bones, I mean, it had to. I mean, everybody was thinking the same thing. Travel and tourism is going to come out of this pandemic so changed, and we're going to come out of this changed as travelers, because, we're going through this period of being deprived of this privilege. I mean, it is a huge privilege to be able to travel. So I wanted to write something coming out of the pandemic that was going to help people in this journey, that was going to help guide us all to think in a more nuanced way about the importance of our travels and what we do. And this was something that I felt really personally. This is something that I wanted to understand myself. So I'll go ahead and move on to my next little slide here. Yeah, hi, that's me on my way to the airport in India. But this is me. I wanted to set out. I wanted to write a book that was at once going to be like my journey and my exploration and my knowledge-seeking adventure, right, around the world. And I wanted to write a book that was going to help people come along with me. I wanted to invite people to come along with me on this journey, as I'm just trying to do my best here, right? I am not a perfect person. I don't make perfect decisions when I travel or otherwise, but I'm trying to do my best. And I feel like there are so many other people who might want to join me in that journey. So what I'm going to go through now is when I set off to write the book, I knew I was going to travel for it, of course, and I went to a whole series of places. And I'm going to share some of those stories with you, so you can kind of come along with me as I was exploring and learning. And then toward the end of the presentation, I'm going to give you the shape, how these things took shape, and the takeaways that I drew from my travels and the people I met on the travels, and how I want to shape that and how I want to deliver that to readers. So, but here I am setting off on my mission. But I have to say, before I really left home, before I started traveling for this book, I thought, you know what? I need to understand, and I need to help my readers understand, because really I feel like we're all kind of in this together, right? I want to understand how we got to this point in travel. How do we get to this particular moment in travel? And I thought, let me look back at the last 50 years, say, and try to understand how do we get here? Like, what happened? Because the world of travel and tourism is so different. We look at, now versus 1960. And I'm like, how can I bring readers up to the present moment? And I thought the best way to do that, let me tell the story of these two young people. And like, I can't, hands up in the chat if you recognize them off the back of this photo, like extra credit points to you. But I'll, just cut to the chase. This is Tony and Maureen Wheeler in a photo taken in 1973. So Tony and Maureen Wheeler are the co-founders of Lonely Planet, which of course is the most influential travel brand of the 20th century. And it all started with an overland trip that Tony and Maureen, who had just gotten married and they were in their early mid-20s, they took from London all the way to Australia in 1972. And Tony, along the way, was writing notes, like capturing everything, all the details of their journey, because he's kind of like an avid note taker, just sort of by default, or that's his, personality. And they got to Australia, they had 27 cents left to their name. And then they realized there was actually a lot of appetite for the information that they had gathered on their travels. So they literally typed it up with a typewriter, got a friend with a printing press, and created their very first book, which they're holding here in the photo, across Asia on the cheap. And this was the beginning of a brand, which they called Lonely Planet right from the start. Tony came up with the name. He doodled the brand logo on a piece of paper, which is essentially the logo has remained unchanged ever since his little doodle in 1973. And this was really the start of this travel brand that transformed the way that so many of us are able to see the world and think about exploring the world. Because if you think back to the moment when Tony and Maureen traveled from London to Australia, I mean, there was no like English language guidebook to a country like Thailand, or to a country like Cambodia, or to a country like India, even, right? They were really at the forefront. I mean, also for this section of the book where I write about how Lonely Planet, changed the way we travel. And of course, I tell the story of Lonely Planet, but there were other guidebooks that were emerging at the same time. I interviewed Mark Ellingham, the founder of the Rough Guides, who was writing travel guidebooks in the 1980s about places like, Greece and other destinations in sort of like Central and Eastern Europe. And he told me, he was like, you got to understand, Paige, like in the early 80s, like writing guidebooks about Eastern Europe, it was like frontline journalism, right? Like there were not guidebooks to these places. These people were beating a path that would change the way so many of us travel and so many of us see the world. And of course, there were many different players in this kind of phenomenon of the guidebooks, and I got to interview a lot of them for this first chapter of the book. But Tony and Maureen, and I got to interview Tony a couple of times, which was really cool. They ended up building this company that by the time they sold the company to the BBC in 2007, it was valued at $200 million, and they were publishing 50 titles, right? In I don't know how many languages, but lots of languages. So this single brand had an enormous influence on the world, both on people and how we travel. And I, was certainly somebody toting around my Lonely Planet guidebook in the late 90s when I was first traveling. And it changed the places themselves, right? And I get into this in the book, the so-called Lonely Planet effect of how actually the appearance of a guidebook, especially in a kind of a more rural or remote or less visited place, can have a huge impact on the place. And, some people reasonable people disagree on whether that's a positive or a negative impact, or it depends on the place in a lot of cases. So some complications are starting to arise too with this phenomenon of the guidebook. So anyway, so I'm using the story of Lonely Planet and Tony and Maureen to bring us into the sort of the present moment, or almost to the present moment, I should say, because after exploring the history of the rise of Lonely Planet and the rise of the travel guidebook, I kind of go into how travel and the whole world of travel, like everything else in our lives, basically pretty much shifted online from the mid 90s until the 2010s. And we see on the left, I took a screenshot of an article that was published in Foreign Policy on October 5th, 2010, which happened to be the day before Instagram appeared in the Apple App Store. So the day before the official launch of Instagram, the journalist Graham Wood declared travel writing is dead in the pages of Foreign Policy. And how he was right and wrong in that, right? He was right in that it was going through a profound shift, But he was wrong, I would say, and that basically travel writing became a much more visual genre, and we all became travel writers, right? With the rise of social media, travel content now, this is the new form of travel writing, and a lot of academics have written about this. And I explore this in the book, the impact of moving from a very sort of let's say a high barrier to entry world of travel writing where you have like editors and you have publishers who are making decisions about who gets to tell these stories, and you have the kind of the lofty author narrator going off to some part of the world and recounting his tales and his exploits to the readers back home. Now, right, we have an explosion in the diversity of voices that are able to share their travel narratives, right? We can all be our own travel writers now, which is wonderful and much more diverse, and we have all these different perspectives and voices to draw from. It comes with its own sort of challenges, right? And here I have a photo. I was in Cambodia in late 2022 for the book, and really one of the things that really struck me from that visit, which is not at all what I was going to research, but the thing that really struck me was just how much social media was driving the way that tourism was happening around Angkor Wat, right? And this is a photo I took at sunrise. Of course, I got the photo of all the people holding their phones, but what was I doing, right? I was holding my phone, taking the picture of them holding their phones, right? So I'm like, and I kind of made fun of myself a little bit in the book about some of the social media stuff that I've done, that in retrospect, I'm looking back on it after having researched social media and travel and learned about this. And I'm kind of like, actually, do you know what? Like, I think I might do things a little bit differently now, knowing what I know and having learned what I've learned. So this is, anyway, one of the places that I think is really fascinating in terms of the impact of social media is this particular canyon on the south coast of Iceland. And again, like extra credit points if you're able to name the person who's wearing the white hoodie in this photo. I'll give you a hint. It's a screenshot from a music video. So yes, this is the one and only Justin Bieber standing on the edge of this beautiful canyon on the wild, remote southern coast of Iceland. And I went to this canyon for the book, as you'll see in the next slide. But I wanted to tell the story of this canyon because it is really an example of a place that was of a tourist destination that was created by social media, which I think is just a really fascinating phenomenon and something for us to understand, because this corner of Iceland was a piece of sort of privately owned land. Like there were some sheep that were grazing there. The landowners had moved to Reykjavik, but it was really kind of nothing happening there. But then around in 2013, visitors started showing up, adding geolocation tags to their social media posts. And of course, this led to more and more visitors. And then 2015, Justin Bieber himself shows up with a film crew and shoots the video for his song, I'll Show You. And that video is up on YouTube, of course. And the last time I checked, it had more than 500 million views. So you can imagine the effect that this had on the place, but it didn't start with Bieber, right? It started with the people who were posting on Instagram, which is what led him and his team to go there. So this is my little photo from the canyon, which I visited last year. And you can see the little ledge where he walked out. It's now roped off, and there's a little sign saying, don't walk here. And on the right, we have a delightful woman who I get to spend some time with named Fanny Gunnarsdóttir. Fanny is an employee of the Environment Agency of Iceland, and she works there at the site. And she's there to guide visitors. And so she really helped me, understand the kind of the recent history of this canyon. She gave me her perspective on the whole Justin Bieber effect. And she told me about how, in this case, it was really the government playing catch up and, and trying to kind of retrofit the infrastructure after the visitors had already started to come, which is something that, I think, especially in a place like Iceland that has a lot of wild and remote and incredibly beautiful destinations, this is something that they're really having to grapple with. But I loved hanging out with Fanny, and she shared her perspective on how social media is influencing travel there in Iceland, but also, more globally. And she was, a delight to get to spend some time with. So you're looking at the impacts of social media. So now we're going to get into a little bit more of the travels that I took and the people that I met. And the next place, so here we are, here I was in Iceland with Fanny. The next place I want to take you to is the city. Right, who can guess where the city is? You might recognize the four men, in statues there. Yes, that is John, Paul, George, and Ringo. This is Liverpool in the north of England. And I wanted to go to Liverpool because I had read about the stories I had read stories about the city's transformation through tourism. And so the lesson that I really took away from this place was both the political and economic power that tourism can bring to a place if it's, if tourism is shepherded in the right way, shall we say. And the man on the left is a lovely man named John Fitzpatrick, who I met while I was in Liverpool, completely unexpected. Like bumped into him, started talking to him. He ended up taking me around for a few hours and showing me his home city and telling me the story of the transformation of Liverpool. So John was born in Liverpool in February in 1959, and so he saw his city go through this profound transformation. Because in the 1970s and 1980s, like when he was a young man, I mean, Liverpool was one of the poorest urban areas in all of Europe. It had a terrible reputation within England and abroad of being a real kind of like cesspit of violent crime. Had a huge heroin problem. Its nickname was like Smack City in the 80s. There were violent riots in 1981. It was really not the kind of place that the only people who would travel to this place were like really diehard Beatles fans, right? Or really diehard like fans of one of the two local football clubs. But John, so John worked on an oil rig when he was a young man, right? You can kind of see it in his build there. And now guess what he does? Well, he still works as a union organizer, and he's a tour guide, and he owns a house that he rents out to tourists for like tourist accommodation. So John was telling me how tourism had really brought new life and energy to the city, brought new like economic power to the city that really allowed the city to develop on its own terms and according to its own values. And, we talked about, and of course, when I was in Liverpool, I spent time with John, but I also interviewed people from the local government, people from the local like arts council, activists and sort of professors and stuff. So I'm getting this well-rounded view, but I really wanted to pull out John because his personal story really kind of brought it all home. But this is a city that was a European capital of culture in the early 2000s. And it was a city that became a UNESCO heritage site. Also, I think it was inscribed in 2003, 2004. But then the city ended up developing. They decided they wanted to develop and become more modern, so much so that UNESCO actually took away the UNESCO World Heritage status. But, Liverpool said, you know what? It's okay, actually. Like, we don't need to keep our historic waterfront historic for the purpose of UNESCO. We want to develop on our own, on our own terms, according to our own values, which is much more sort of forward thinking and a little bit contrarian, to be honest. And you know what? The city's tourists didn't even blink. Like the tourist numbers continued to rise really steadily, even with the withdrawal of the UNESCO World Heritage status, which I thought was interesting. And then last year, just a month before I was in Liverpool, the city hosted the Eurovision Song Contest, which brought a huge amount of life and energy to the city. So I thought this was a really interesting example that I wanted to share in the book about the economic and political kind of soft power that can come with tourism if it's done, in the right way. And then, but it's not all kind of like sunshine and rainbows in the world of tourism, right? Another place that I went to for the book where I took a really important lesson that I share is the state of Hawaii, which is a place that is very close to my heart because my sister has actually been a resident of Hawaii for more than 20 years. So it's a place that I have visited many times over the years, first to visit her before I started thinking about going for my research for my book. But on my most recent visit, I was really digging into the importance of including local voices in how tourism is managed, because this is something that has not historically been done in Hawaii. The tourism industry there has been really growing very steadily and very, very quickly since like the 1950s, 1960s, essentially since Hawaii became a state. Tourism has been a huge driver of the local economy. But there are people like this man on the right, Kuike, who is native son, as he described it, of Waimanalo, which is a community on Oahu, so on the island of Oahu, which is also home to Honolulu, the capital city. But Waimanalo is on the windward side of Oahu, which is where Kuike grew up. And this is a place that developed a reputation in the 80s and 90s as the kind of place where tourists might get ripped off, like where they might have their bags stolen when they're swimming on the beach. And it's also a place where you can see native Hawaiians. It's a beautiful beach, and Kuike, I pictured, I took this photo of him there on the beach. He showed me around. Tourists are coming, it's very well maintained, and along one side of the beach, you have, or alongside of sort of the grassy area right next to the beach, you have a whole string of tents, which are homes to Native Hawaiians who can't afford to buy houses in their home community. And Kuike says this is because all of the non-Hawaii residents who have come and bought second homes there and have really priced out the natives, the people whose home this is, whose ancestral home this is. So I spent time with Kuike, and he told me some really strong things. He thinks all tourists should leave Hawaii, right? I spent a lot of time in Hawaii talking to other people. I spent a lot of time with two other Native Hawaiians who I share, who I describe in the book, who have very different perspectives from his. But I wanted to include his because it challenged me. And he was very polite. He was incredibly polite, incredibly kind man. And he took me around and he wanted to share his story. And I'm like, I think it's important for my readers to know his story as well. So I share the story of Kuike and tourism in Hawaii, and also in the broader context of other kind of political debates or policy debates that are happening in Hawaii around tourism. So that was one story that I wanted to pull out for you here. And then I also spent a little bit more time in my kind of immediate neighborhood in the French Alps, which, where I was living in the little village for 5 years. And I went to spend time at the Mer de Glace, which is the biggest glacier in the French Alps, because I wanted to understand this phenomenon of last chance tourism, which you might have heard of, right? And I think it's kind of something that's been a bit of a buzzword for several years now. But last chance tourism is this idea that, climate change is causing a number of tourist destinations, namely glaciers, but not solely glaciers, to disappear, right? And it's the very ephemeral nature of these tourist destinations is actually motivating people to want to come. Okay, so if that's our definition of last chance tourism, and surveys are finding that this is a real phenomenon, people are being motivated by this. What does that mean? Is it a good thing? I don't know. Is that a bad thing? I don't know, let me go look, let me talk to some people, let me go see for myself. And so the Mer de Glace I'd been to many times before as, someone who has lived in this part of the world for a while. But I went back and I spent a day with the man on the right. His name is Brad Carlson, which, as you can guess by his name, he's not native. He wasn't born in France. He's a Vermonter, actually. But he's lived in France for since he was, I think, 20 or 21 years old. And he was the first non-European to be inducted into the Compagnie de Guide de Chamonix, so the official mountain guiding company of Chamonix. So he is both kind of American and he has French nationality now, and he has a PhD in ecology, right? So really interesting. And he's one of a few people within the Compagnie de Guide de Chamonix who are leading the work of that company in terms of thinking about how they're adapting what they do as mountain guides to take into account the changing climate. And so I spent a long time with Brad talking to him about how he sees, a mountain guide as being a real ambassador for the natural world. And he sees his role as a guide to really both shepherd people through the wilderness and help them find the courage and the wherewithal to consider their own place in the scene, right? And so we have some, thinking about this last chance tourism debate, there are some people who say, actually visiting a glacier that's disappearing can be a profoundly emotional, moving experience. I mean, I saw it actually, I reported on the Mer de Glace for the New York Times earlier this year and literally saw more, kind of people in their sort of 60s and 70s being moved almost to tears, being really struck by French, older French people who had seen this glacier as children, and they come back now decades later and they see just how much it's dropped. I mean, people are shocked, right? This is something that they're going to take away. They're going to come away from that experience profoundly moved. Does that always happen? No, right? That doesn't always happen. And of course, when we visit a glacier, we emit carbon emissions and so it's not necessarily always going to be a profound experience. So with Brad, getting into okay, what makes a last chance tourist, what makes that kind of a last chance tourist visit something profound and potentially really positive in terms of, okay, somebody who's really profoundly affected might change their behavior afterwards, right? They might not, but they might. So that was I really was very privileged to have a chance to explore this topic in this beautiful landscape with this excellent guide. And then, of course, this is, you'll probably recognize this place right off the bat. I got to spend some time in the red light district of Amsterdam, which is, of course, like probably one of the world's most iconic tourist destinations. And I wanted to go to the red light district because I really wanted to understand this concept of a tourist trap, right? What is a tourist trap? And I think a lot of people, certainly a lot of like Dutch people, would describe the red light district of Amsterdam as a kind of quintessential tourist trap. So what is it about these places that is so appealing, right? Because we've all been to places that could be described as tourist traps. We might not go to the tourist traps that are kind of like in the town next door, in the state next door, but when we fly across an ocean, I think there's a probably pretty good chance that we might end up in one. Myself, like I'm raising my hand here too. So what is the appeal of these places? And I think in the red light district, where I really write about some of the debates around how to manage tourism in this place and make sure that residents and tourists can live together in harmony. But here it's really about that escape from reality, that escape into a world of fantasy, which of course in the red light district is represented by sex and drugs, right? And and we all need that. And I say in the book, like, we all need a sort of a fantasy escape, whether it's into sex and drugs or it's into Disneyland, which I also write about in the same chapter, right? We all need an escape from our reality. That's fine. So tourist traps, I think, serve a really important function for the human psyche. But, I think the biggest problem with tourist traps, perhaps the only real problem with tourist traps, is when the sort of world-bending fantasy world that they represent bumps up against the realities of everyday life for the people who live there, right? So this is something that I get into in this chapter of the book, and I got to spend some time with this woman, Stephanie Caton, on the right, who is a resident of the red light district and who is kind of like a social entrepreneur. And she had a stand going when I was there, and I spent a long time talking with her. She really sees tourists as integral members of the community of the red light district, and she's looking for ways, and I met other people who were saying the same thing and had similar stories, who are really looking for ways to incorporate tourists into the neighborhood, into the community in a really kind of smooth and mutually supportive way. So I had a fascinating time in Amsterdam. That was a really fun chapter to write as well. It's chapter 6. And then, okay, this is the final trip that I'm going to tell you about. And it was one of the last, not the last, but one of the last trips I took. I went to Saudi Arabia. And the lesson that I took away from here, it really had to do with the power of the human connections that we make when we travel and the importance of putting ourselves outside of our comfort zones when we travel, right? Because I was way outside of my comfort zone going to Saudi Arabia, right? As a solo female traveler, right? I just went there on my own. As a journalist, right? Like these are things that I didn't speak any Arabic. I've since learned a bit, but I didn't speak any Arabic at the time. I'd never been to like the Arabian Peninsula other than to kind of change planes in Doha. This was a really foreign place for me, but I had read so much about tourism in Saudi Arabia and how it was changing. I'd interviewed academics who encouraged me to go. My book editor was like, that sounds fascinating, So I was like, what the heck? Like, I'm just going to do it, right? I'm going to go. So I like asked friends of friends and, got as many tips and advice as many tips and as much advice as I could find. And off I went. I ordered myself a burqa on Amazon, and off I went to Saudi Arabia. And I came away from that. There are a number of kind of anecdotes that I share in the book, and this is in the last chapter of the book. But I introduce my readers to Fatima Al-Zamam, who you see on the right-hand side, on the picture on the right here. She was my tour guide for the day in Riyadh. We spent like 12 hours together, riding around in her pickup truck, which you see her, commandeering there. And Fatima, like, completely blew open any sort of preconceived notions I had about Saudi Arabia. And I'll add, she wasn't the only woman to do this. She was the last woman I met in Saudi Arabia who really did this, and the most, maybe compelling, or the most kind of, the one who had the biggest impact on me. So she's the one who I describe in the book, but I had similar experiences actually with other women who I met in Saudi Arabia. And just like her personal story and her views on things, we really connected. Like we became friends over the course of those 12 hours. You can see we're kind of like, she's a lot of fun. Like we have a lot of fun together. She had just, in this picture, she went into park illegally, and a cop like came over and put like a traffic cone in front of her, and she just got out and picked up the traffic cone and moved it while the cop was right there. I was like, what are you doing? And she was like, it's fine. And she gets back in the car and I took the picture. So that's Fatima, right? And we became friends, and we had some experiences together. I share some anecdotes in the book. Did we talk about her country's politics? Absolutely. Did I ask her about, Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist who was most like, or who, the US government has concluded was assassinated by, the Saudi officials? Yeah, we talked about that. Did we have different opinions on that? Absolutely. Did we remain friends? Are we still friends? I got a text from her yesterday. Yeah, we're friends, right? And this is like the power of my time in Saudi Arabia. It really was mind-opening in a way that I really wasn't expecting. So I kind of try to put that across in the book. And I had a lot of fun with Fatima, and I hope you do too when you read her section. So right as I was finishing up my travels for the book, I opened my New Yorker app one day, and I see this essay that appears, and I was like, oh God, because I immediately recognized the name of Agnes Callard, who is, a very noted philosopher and writer, and a woman whose writing I've read and appreciated and really respect. And so when I was like, oh my God, no, she wrote that. Oh, this is gonna be tough. So, but I read this essay, and I appreciate this essay so much. And I agree with so much of what she wrote, and I disagree with her in some really important ways. But I'm mainly grateful for her for writing this essay because it helped me develop my response to it. And watching sort of the response that I had to it, that really helped me create the overarching framework for the book and the overarching message that I wanted to deliver to readers, and that I wanted to take away, myself personally from having written this book. And that is, so in this essay, Callard calls tourists unchanged changers, right? So she says tourists we kind of delude ourselves. We think that we're going to have these profound experiences, but really we're just following the guidebook, or we're following somebody else's list of priorities. We're ticking boxes. We're feeling like we achieved something. We're getting some little life experiences to collect in our backpack so we can go home and show them to our friends and win praise. We're traveling to distract ourselves from the fact that we're going to die, she says toward the end of the essay, which I was like, oh wow, it's kind of deep. And we're unchanged changers. So we change the places that we go in ways that are, she's saying, are negative, and we remain unchanged by the experience. And I was like, okay, well, that's a really helpful sort of understanding, because I recognize, do those tourists exist? Do those tourists exist? Absolutely. Have I been that kind of tourist? Yes. Right. I have been that kind of tourist myself. Am I always that kind of tourist? Not at all. Not at all. Right. So I'm like, okay, how do I think about this? And I started to think about a sort of a spectrum of, on one end, we have the old tourist, which is basically Callard's definition of a tourist, and an unchanged changer. And I was like, well, what if we take that and we look at the other end of the spectrum, and we have a new tourist? What is that new tourist? What does that look like? How do we embody this new approach to travel? So in the final chapter of the book, where I'm also writing about Fatima and Saudi Arabia, I'm responding to Callard's essay and setting out sort of my vision and understanding of what a new tourist is. And so just now we're kind of done with the travels, we're done with the sort of world, kind of hopping around the world. And here's what I concluded. So here's what I learned after having set off on my mission. It's just really, the new tourist, starting from Callard's definition of the unchanged changer, I call it the new tourist is a changed and enlightened changer, right? They're changed by the experience. So this means, to be a new tourist, to be this new type of tourist, we have to open ourselves, we have to crack ourselves open, hearts and minds and souls, to be changed by our travels, right? Which isn't always an easy thing to do, but it starts by getting outside your comfort zone. It starts by flying to a country that you're scared to visit, right? That's how we kind of change our perspectives on things, right? And an enlightened changer. Okay, we're always going to change the places we visit. It's impossible that we don't. But at least we can be awake to the changes that we have on that place. We can take the time to educate ourselves about the impact that we're going to have. And we can sort of use that information, use that knowledge that we've just given ourselves by taking the time to do some Googling, or, educating ourselves about the place. We can use that knowledge to inform our decisions, inform the decisions that we make when we travel, so that we can really maximize the possibility that we're going to have that the positive benefits of our travels, both for ourselves as individuals and for the place that we're visiting, the positive impacts are going to outweigh the negative ones. And I think, as I make the case in the book, I mean, I think the positive impacts of travel are huge and so important, especially like more important now than at any point in human history, right? Because if we look at, you know, all the challenges that humanity is going to face in the next sort of coming years and decades, right? What are we going to face? We might have another pandemic even worse than COVID, right? We might have, you know, AI taking over things. We might have a global thermonuclear war, right? You know, climate catastrophe. All of these crises are completely ignorant of national borders, right? Completely ignorant of national borders. We need to learn to have empathy for people who pray to a different God, who speak a different language, who dress differently, you know, who eat differently, who you know, who are different from ourselves. We need, more than ever in the history of humanity, we need to be able to work with these people, right? And so I think tourism is, you know, the world's biggest mover of human beings. Like I said at the beginning, 1.5 billion international tourist arrivals. If we can channel the power of this enormous phenomenon of tourism, then, you know, that's, I think that can give us a lot of, you know, that can do a lot of good in the world. So this is my understanding of what a new tourist is. And in practice, you know, so what does this look like? Okay, so like, nice idea, Paige, like, I'm planning my next trip, like, what should I do? You know, I don't give like concrete tips in the book, because I say in the introduction, you know, a lot of books have been written about like how to travel more sustainably or more mindfully. And I see this book as kind of a prequel to all of those. This is the book that you read that will inspire you to go buy that book, right? That will give you the motivation to go and kind of ask yourself these questions and look for better ways to do it. But just a few tips, and these are things that I do, you know, in my own travels. But again, like I was just saying, you know, educate yourself about local tourism challenges, learn the language, just because this is going to increase the chances that you will, even if it's just like hello, goodbye, and thank you, right? This is going to increase the odds of you being able to create a real human connection with people you meet there. And then, you know, I really love to stress this next one. Write your own list of things to do. Don't go off like the TripAdvisor top 10. Don't go off, you know, 1,000 places to see before you die. Okay, maybe look at those a little bit for inspiration. But when you're thinking about where to go, do a lot of introspection, you know, reflect. What is the place that's really going to speak to you? Like, what is the place that, like, maybe, you know, the values of that place really align with your own, or you're just really fascinated by a particular aspect of the place's history that you really want to learn about. Like, it's okay to have a list of priorities of things you want to see, but make sure that this is your own list and it's not somebody else's. You're not just like taking some top 10 list that somebody else generated, right? Make sure you're traveling kind of for the right reasons, I want to say. Frequent locally owned businesses as much as you can, you know, avoid the hotel chains if you can, you know, always if you can, right? Like these are like, we're all just doing our best, right? I love to suggest that people hire a local tour guide. I mean, some of my, you know, Fatima was like a wonderful connection. Brad was a wonderful connection. I paid these people for the, you know, I employed them for the day, just like they, you know, other people employ them to do their jobs. But that didn't, you know, like, but it gave me a chance to have a really, you know, in-depth conversation with these people. Like when you're kind of together one-on-one for several hours, you can get to know somebody, you can build a human connection. And that's really what, like, those are the kind of things that you're going to end up taking away from your travels, much more than like, you know, it'll be much more important to you than the souvenir or whatever you bring home. And then I like to say, like, commit to coming home with your mind changed on at least one thing, because I think it's really, if you know, and maybe it's maybe it's not like a political perspective, maybe it's just like a new food or a new drink or like a new type of like museum or a new type of music or something. Just really like go into your travels thinking, do you know, I wanna have my mind changed. I'm ready for this. Like, I'm gonna do something that I didn't expect I might like. Maybe it'll go badly, maybe it'll go well, but like, just be very explicit in saying that, like, I'm coming into this trip with an open mind. And then also I love to say, you know, travel isn't about the distance, which is to quote my friend Aziz Abusera, who does a lot of talking on the importance of travel. You can take all of this, you know, all of these lessons, all of this mindset, and you can travel to the other side of your home city, right? You can travel into a community who, you know, of people who live near you, but who have a different background from you. You don't have to fly across an ocean to draw many of the benefits and the, you know, draw on the kind of benefits and constructive power of travel and tourism. That's not to say like never travel farther away, but try to embrace this sort of curiosity and real kind of search for human connection in your own neighborhood as well, or in your own community. So those are my kind of my tips, practical tips, takeaways for how to be a new tourist in practice. But there we are at the end of my journey. I will just share another photo of the book cover, and I was very grateful to get a couple of like warm reviews, warm early reviews here. So if this presentation spoke to you, I would really encourage you to reach out to me personally. Whether you've read the book or not, I always like to engage with people on these topics. If you have read the book, if you'd like me to speak to like a book club or anything, I would be absolutely delighted to engage with you on that. So I've put my Instagram handle here. You can find me there and send me a direct message. And then my email, hello@paigemcclanahan.com. I'm sorry, my last name is a little unwieldy. It's very phonetic though. So say hi, because I really, like, my goal in writing this book is to really inspire people to have some self-reflection, and to take people on a fun and enlightening journey, and inspire people to ask questions of themselves and to have conversations, because I think that's how we can all learn from each other, and encourage all of us to become more thoughtful and sensitive and, enlightened travelers. So thank you very much. I'll end there.
Hi, Paige. Wow, that was amazing. Oh, I just feel like I need to go out and travel somewhere, even like up the street. Okay, so I have a couple of questions, and then obviously if anybody has questions, please put them in the Q&A and I'll moderate them to Paige. But I have a question about people. So that now travel is more global. Like now I've been in places where before you would only see like maybe American or European travelers. Now you're seeing them from all over the world. Like the last time we went to Venice, it was packed with people from Southeast Asia, from Africa. How does that affect the view of the people living there, that now they have this global community coming to visit them?
Oh, interesting. I think that's a good question, and one I think that, yeah, like as you're saying, with travel increasing around the world, we're seeing more and more of. I mean, the thing that comes to mind is, in response to your question, is that I interviewed the mayor of Chamonix, France, which is a pretty classic tourist destination and has been for a long time. For the book, I don't actually quote him in the book, but I had a really useful and enlightening conversation with him, and we're talking about like the challenges of kind of like visitor flows in Chamonix. And he was saying, yeah, we're getting, more tourists from Asia, and, which he was cool. Like, he was positive about this. And he was like, but do you know where the most problematic tourists come from, Paige? And I was like, oh, I'm curious, like, do tell. And he was like, well, and I was like, well, what do you mean by problematic? And he was like, well, the people who come and like occupy space, but don't actually spend that much money. And he was like, yes. And I'm kind of like, oh my gosh, is he going to see Americans, And he was like, Haute-Savoie, which is the department that Chamonix is in. It's day. He's like, the bigger our problem tourists are basically the people who come for day trips from an hour away.
Interesting.
Because these are the people who come, they're probably going to bring like a packed lunch, right? They're going to spend very little money in the place, and they're going to occupy as much space. They're going to use the infrastructure just as much as somebody who comes, somebody who comes for longer, right? But they're going to leave much less of a positive economic impact in their wake. And I had a very similar conversation with an Italian journalist whose work I respect so much, and she's written a lot about tourism challenges in Venice. And she is a resident of Milan. And I was having this conversation with her, and she was like, Paige, the biggest challenge for tourism in Venice isn't the people who come, for a week from the United States or wherever. It's the day trippers from Milan who come and like clog the streets, and then they're there for 4 hours right in the middle of the day when it's like really heaving, and then they go home and they bought a sandwich and a postcard and they took up all this space. So I think so many tourist destinations are talking about now how to get a high value visitor, and these are everybody wants visitors who come and stay a long time. Like every tourist destination, this is what they're trying to get to. So I think in a way, the fact that people are traveling longer distances, so maybe that tourist in Venice who has come all the way from Southeast Asia, I mean, they might be just doing, it's possible they're just spending a few hours there en route to the next destination on their itinerary. But if they're coming and they're spending a longer time there, then they could have, a really positive power. And if they're coming at sort of an off-peak time of year and they're visiting some of the lesser known museums, they could have a really positive impact on the place. And then you have a whole level of cultural kind of connection that you wouldn't have had before. So I think it's a complicated, it's an interesting question with maybe a complicated answer.
Yeah, no, I'm sure like all of this is kind of complicated. I'm going to go back to some of the questions from our attendees. Lee asked us early on, why did you move there? I'm assuming they mean France.
Why we went to the little village? That's an excellent question, and while we can have a long conversation about my life choices and everything. So no, my husband and I met in Geneva, Switzerland. We were both there for work, and we got to know this little village as like a weekend destination. So I tell this story in the introduction of the book. And we went up, we would go up for the weekend and just kind of escape and go hiking or skiing or whatever. We moved from Geneva to West Africa, then to England, then to East Africa. We had 2 children along the way. And at some point we were like, okay, we're ready to kind of settle down somewhere for a little while. And then we thought like, what about that lovely little village that we used to go to? And so we moved from Nairobi, Kenya in 2018. We moved from Kenya to the little village in the French Alps, put our kids in the local school. And I was working self-employed as a journalist and writer and editor, and my husband was was working self-employed as a consultant. So we just set up life there, and it was really the lifestyle that drew us, I guess, is the short answer. But there's a much longer answer too.
Karen asks, how do you usually find local guides?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. Well, let me just think specifically. Like I found Fatima through literally like the friend of a friend of a friend. So I'm just going through, especially in Saudi Arabia, which is a place, that I didn't have any personal experience with. I would say like reach out to contacts, ask for personal recommendations. Excuse me, ask for personal recommendations whenever you can. There are, probably in, check a guidebook might have local listings for local tour guides. Contact the local tourism board. There you go. That's the best idea. So because they will have a list of the registered tour guides. A lot of countries have kind of official certification programs for their tour guides. So just do a quick Google search to see if that's a thing wherever it is that you want to visit. Because, a lot of these tour guides have to go through official trainings and have to take really rigorous exams. And so you want to make sure you go with somebody who's fully qualified. But the local tourism board, so if you go to like, Google, like visit Paris or visit Barcelona or whatever, and contact those people, say, please, can you connect me with a local tour guide? They should be able to help you. But otherwise, you're asking for among friends, if you know anybody who's been there, if they have a recommendation, that's another way to go about it too.
What do you think of virtual travel tours hosted by local guides in foreign countries?
Yeah, thank you for this question too. And this is something that I kind of touch on briefly in the book. Because during the pandemic, like the first travel story I did after all the lockdowns hit was with my fellow journalist, Deborah Kamen. Deborah, you're wonderful. Shout out to Deborah. We did this 52 places virtually. So the New York Times always do their 52 places to go. And our editors asked us to do a 52 places virtually. So how you can get a virtual taste of the 52 places. Oh my gosh, that was like a bit of a, that was a heavy digging, sort of doing the research for that one. So we split it up. But I think virtual tours, virtual reality, even in some cases, like online visits, these are fascinating ways to get a taste. And maybe that'll be enough for you. Like maybe, you want to just get that little taste, and that's going to sort of, that's going to be enough for you. You're not going to want to go visit, but maybe it'll whet your appetite and inspire you to plan a trip. But I think it's wonderful that especially some of the really iconic destinations that are maybe struggling with the weight of kind of human bodies on them, the fact that you can get a virtual taste, because for a lot of people that might be enough, and that might mean they get that, they can sort of have that experience that they want, and the place doesn't have that extra human body to manage. So I think, in the right sort of time and place, it can be a really good thing.
Certainly we have a lot of armchair travelers in our Page
Totally.
Memories.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful.
Yeah. So Francis asks, did you have any interaction with Rick Steves or his travel company or guidebooks?
Yes, yes. I've interviewed Rick many times. I first interviewed him for the New York Times back in 2021, which was a lot of fun. And then I interviewed him for this book, and I quote him in this book in the chapter about the history of the Lonely Planet, or the history of travel guidebooks. And I'm kind of focusing on Tony and Maureen Wheeler because I needed kind of one narrative thread, and they had the biggest sort of global impact. But of course, Rick Steves has had a huge impact on travel in the United States. And he is still out there doing it, right? I mean, the Wheelers kind of sold off, 15, more than 15 years ago now. But Rick is still out there like every summer, like doing the research for his guidebooks, which is kind of amazing. And he and I really see eye to eye in our vision and our understanding of travel. And actually, just last night, I was super lucky. I did a webinar for an audience of Rick Steves travelers. I did his Monday night travel thing. Rick didn't join me for that one, but like with his team. So yeah, I love Rick Steves. I could talk about Rick Steves all day, and I love the approach to travel that he espouses and that he really kind of promotes. So he's a great guy, and I was lucky enough to interview him for this book too.
Yeah, I think that there was something you mentioned early on about travel guidebooks, and that there was a time when they weren't being used as much because everybody thought they could just Google everything. But now I'm finding that there's even more demand for it because people want that book. They just want to be able to flip through it.
Exactly. And that's what Rick told me when I asked him. I was like, how are sales going these days, Rick? Toward the end of when I was interviewing him for this book, and he was like, actually, Paige, like, it's going really well. I think he told me, I mean, I have this in the book, but like, I'm pretty sure I'm remembering this correctly, that he sells about 1 million books a year, right? Like his books are selling well. There's still a strong appetite for guidebooks. So I think this kind of like I didn't kind of get into this too much in this presentation, but in the book I said, like, actually, there was this kind of decline and fall, and people are thinking the guidebooks are done. But actually, there's been a bounce back, and there are a few publishers, guidebook publishers, who are doing well now, who told me that guidebook sales are actually going up.
I mean, as a library, we update our collection of guidebooks almost every 2 years.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, because things change so quickly now. Terry says, I've started using AI for travel planning and love it. I'm getting very personalized suggestions. Do you use it?
Wow, this is the second time AI has come up in a question in like a sort of interview or something I'm doing. And the short answer is no, I haven't used it. The longer answer is like, oh my gosh, I need to educate myself about this and I should try it. I'm curious to hear how that's going, because I finished the manuscript for this book like toward the end of last year, and I feel like I'm already kind of like things are changing so quickly, and AI is already having such a big impact on travel. So this is something, maybe it'll be for book number 2. I need to watch how this is shifting, and that's really interesting to hear that you're getting these really personalized recommendations. I mean, that sounds like a good, something that's worth exploring and potentially a good thing. I would just say maybe, double check, like, don't rely only on AI. You maybe use that as your starting point, but then also draw on other resources. And always do that sort of gut check against, like, okay, is this in line with my own priorities and interests and values? And I would say, just a general tip in terms of traveling, I always, whether I'm traveling for work or personally, always like to have a few kind of fixed things in the itinerary, like a few kind of like, tentpole like moments or experiences or interviews I'm going to do. And I try to leave as much time as possible. Well, I know I'm going to kind of like for me, thinking for like a work trip, I know I'm going to get the interviews I need to get, but I want to leave as much time as possible to have experiences like meeting that guy John in Liverpool, who literally, like, we just started talking on the sidewalk, and I ended up spending like 3 or 4 hours with him. So leave time in your schedule for that too, so you can meet people and kind of be spontaneous and follow your nose, which is always fun.
Well, Terry just left a follow-up note that she uses Gemini, so we should all check into that and see if it works for us.
Thank you, Terry. I'm writing that down. Gemini.
I'm gonna ask 2 more questions, maybe 3. Somebody asks, Airbnb started out focused on human connection. Now with keyless entry and the commercialization perversion, most of the time we don't even meet the host. How does Airbnb fit into all of this, or does it?
Thank you for that question. Yes, I read about Airbnb in the context of Barcelona, which so in the book, and which is also, like, I've written about Barcelona and Airbnb for the New York Times as well, but I really go into some greater depth in the book. And I think, my takeaway with Airbnb is, like, I would say it's the kind of the commercialization and the kind of the professional commercial operators who are really kind of having the kind of the stronger negative impacts in terms of like what we're seeing in terms of shifts in the housing market and the price of housing, the availability of housing in some of these places. So have I used Airbnb? Absolutely. Like, will I use Airbnb in the future? Quite possibly, probably. Would I do it under any circumstance? Absolutely not. So I would say just it's something to, it's a tool. It's something to use, like, exercise with caution, do with care, like do your homework on the local rules. And yeah, I think really try whenever possible to make sure that you're interacting with an actual, human being who owns this place. And it's kind of like try to keep that sort of the original Airbnb model, because those people do exist. I mean, I have, like, close friends who own things that they rent out on Airbnb in the sort of the original spirit of the company. So those people do exist, but it might just take a little bit more rooting around to find them.
Yep. Have you found that tourism has increased as people are and places are telling a wider story of their history? Like, let's say Louisiana and the mansions. Originally, it was really about the people who owned those mansions, but now they're telling the story of the slaves and the indentured servants and a wider story. So have you found that tourism has increased because of people seeing themselves in those stories?
Oh, interesting. That's a fascinating question. I mean, what you shared about New Orleans makes me think of one of like my favorite books that I've read in the last several years. And it's a book by the very noted writer named Clint Smith, and his book, How the Word is Passed. And basically, it's not a travel book per se, but he basically, in this book, I think it was published a few years ago, I'd have to double check that, fairly recently, he goes around the United States to various like historic sites that are kind of the bearers of the story of slavery in the United States. And but of course, these are all tourist destinations, right? Or almost all tourist destinations. And he's going and he's visiting them as tourists and seeing the power of these places sharing the story, and how, like, the history that we understand now is really a result of, like, the stories that are being propagated by these tourist destinations. So I think thinking about tourist destinations and the passage of, like, how we pass history down through the years is really interesting. And I'm also, your question also makes me think of Charleston, South Carolina, where I know just recently, I think last year, they had the opening of the International African American Museum, which I haven't been to, but I was lucky to interview Dr. Tanya Matthews, who's the head of this museum. I interviewed her for the New York Times. Is that last year or the year before? Last year, I think. Fascinating interview. And we talked a lot about how tourism in Charleston, South Carolina, which is where this museum is based, is evolving to include these broader narratives. And she was saying, that this museum has been really welcomed by the tourism community in Charleston, and it's really expanding the types of stories that they have there. And it's bringing new people into Charleston Tourism City Center, because they're offering things like genealogy centers where you can come and they can, experts there who can help you look up your family history, which, of course, if you have, enslaved people in your family background, the records might be harder to find, but they have experts there. So this is really, it's an example of a tourist destination that's really explicitly encouraging people to come and seek their own story in the history that the museum is telling. So
I love that.
Yeah.
Last question, if you don't mind staying for another minute.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
So there's a thing that people go to travel and they expect the people in those places to accommodate them. Have you noticed a shift in people now traveling and being more immersed in the culture versus expecting the culture to adapt to them?
Oh, interesting. Well, I love that you sort of pick out this distinction, because I think I think what you just kind of set up, a sort of like old tourist, new tourist kind of divide. I mean, and I would love to think that this is a trend, that people are becoming more aware, more thoughtful, kind of more humble. Because we do have this sort of like history of seeing ourselves as tourists. We're pure consumers. we're there to pay for a service, you're there to provide it to me, I'm kind of above you, you're sort of there to serve me. Whereas really, what we ought to be doing is remembering that no matter where we travel, we are always first and foremost a guest in someone else's home, right?
Mhm.
And that someone else might be like, the birds and the bees, like out in the wilderness, right? Or it might be, the residents of the red light district of Amsterdam. But this place does not belong to us. We are guests. And just like, when you go stay with your aunt and uncle, or your parents' friends who live in that town you're visiting, you're going to hang up your towel, and you're going to sort of not make a lot of noise at night, and you're going to offer to help with the dishes after dinner, right? We should come to travel with this kind of attitude. And I don't know, I mean, it would be hard to say if I'm seeing this as a trend like more and more. I mean, I'm seeing, in terms of the actual like interactions that I've seen, I am seeing more and more people questioning and like being thoughtful about their, the way that they approach travel in the sort of the planning stages. And I really hope that translates through into, more kind of humble and gracious behavior when they're actually in the place as well. But I mean, that's up to us. That's the challenge, isn't
Mhm.
it? Like that's the homework right there.
I know it sort of reminded me of your second to last slide of just how we should go into travel
Mm.
as opposed to how we have maybe historically done it. So, wow, this is fabulous and fascinating. I'm so appreciative of you taking your time on your book birthday to be with us. I know you
Well,
have,
what are you talking about? I'm so thrilled you've been invited. Like, so
I know I
cool.
remember
Thanks for
reaching out
having
to
me.
you.
Yeah, yeah.
But
I was so
you
delighted to see your email. Yeah.
you have an in-person program tonight in New York
Yes.
City, right?
Yeah. So come see me, get a signed copy of the book. At PNT Knitwear, there's an event happening. So it's a bookstore in Lower Manhattan on Orchard Street. It's happening tonight at 7 p.m. And I'm going to be joined by two fantastic like people who are like more interesting than me in a lot of ways. We're going to have a discussion about all these kinds of things. So if you're anywhere in the vicinity, please come. We would love to see you. And and kind of come have this conversation with us. I'd be so
Excellent.
excited to meet you in person. Yeah.
I do have your newsletter, so I'll send out a link to that in my recap
Perfect.
email.
Thank you.
But thank you again for being here. Good luck with your tour, and everybody who's been here. I hope you get the book, and I hope you have wonderful travels and
And I hope you
experience.
send me, excuse me for interrupting, and I hope you send me an email. Like, really, I would love to hear from you.
Definitely for everybody. Send her an email. All right, everybody. Have a wonderful
Thanks so
day.
much, Mina. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining.
Yep. Thanks, Paige.